There you go. So I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our presenters for today. As stated, there's some really exciting research that's happening across the country, and considering the dearth of knowledge and scholarship that's connected to familial trafficking, when we saw the report that was recently released, we hopped at the opportunity to bring this team here to provide this information to you all. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Leanne, so we can get introductions for our facilitators. And again, this is going to be a really good one. So I got my pen and paper ready for the notes. So off to Leanne.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Freedom Network team, for giving us a chance to connect with the housing grantees. Hello, my name is Leah McCallum DeSalle. I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling in from New Orleans, Louisiana. It's 58, but it feels as cold as Minnesota. I know you're probably laughing for anyone who's up north. Um, I'm a research analyst and TTA provider with RTI International, which is a research nonprofit that's dedicated to improving the human condition. I was the project director on this familial trafficking project and was able to work with two of my incredible colleagues. And I will hand it to Peyton to introduce herself.
Thank you, Leanne. Hi, everybody. My name is Peyton Scalise. I'm a research public health analyst at RTA International. I've been there for a little over 7 years now. My background is in public health by training, but I've focused my whole career on gender-based violence research. And I led the qualitative analysis task on this project, and that's what I'll be presenting on today. And I'll pass it over to Shawnee.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shawnee Basie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm also with RTI. I work as a research analyst here at RTI. I've been here for about 2 years now. And prior to my transition to RTI, I was knee-deep in direct work, shelter management, drop-in center management, with a focus on trafficking, exploitation, gender-based violence, et cetera. So I'm happy to be here.
All right. So I think we can head to the next slide, Sade. So our goals for the presentation today are to describe the research project that we conducted at RTI. The research will identify some common barriers and challenges for anti-human trafficking responders and survivors of familial trafficking, as they were identified in this project. And then we'll share and explore some effective strategies that we identified in the study that could improve and enhance housing practices for familial trafficking survivors. Next slide. This presentation discusses familial trafficking, and while we take care not to move into anything that's too graphic, we still know this is a really sensitive topic. So please pay close attention to your body and your emotions. Feel free to be off camera, take care of yourself, step out of the room, get a glass of water, whatever you need throughout this presentation. You're always welcome to come back and enjoy the recorded webinar later. Next slide. All right. So I'm going to do a quick overview of what this project was before we jump into the meat of it. I do want to start by, just acknowledging and reminding that you all are really experts in this topic to a certain extent as well. Familial trafficking research is really limited. There's not a lot of formal knowledge about it, but people who serve these populations have a lot of informal knowledge. And so we're hoping that we can hear from you along the way, whether it's in the chat or raising your hand or in the Q&A. We want to hear your experiences and expertise. This was a small, localized study, so it may be different in different regions, and we'd love to learn along with you. So please do take advantage and engage as feels comfortable. So this study was funded internally by RTI International to improve training and technical assistance, or TTA, for anti-human trafficking responders who are serving familial trafficking survivors. So like Freedom Network's role is with the housing programs that OVC operates, similarly, we want to help people like Freedom Network, people like us, um, to support responders who are serving these populations. Um, and before we get started, I want to make sure that we're clear about what our definitions are when we're talking about familial trafficking. So for the purpose of this study, our working definition was that familial trafficking, it's also known as family facilitated trafficking or intrafamilial trafficking. It's a form of human trafficking in which the perpetrator is a family member, parent, or caregiver. So family membership can be established through blood relations, like a biological mother, legal ties like a step parent, or functional relationships. So, for example, if there's a child who lives in a house full time, even though it's not that child's not a blood relation, they would informally be a family member. We also talk about training and technical assistance a lot. So I want to make sure we're clear what we mean. TTA is the planning and development and delivery of activities to achieve learning objectives. So really it's that coaching and training and support for you all to achieve your goals with direct services. And then a last note on language. We use victim and survivor to describe people who have lived experience of familial trafficking. In general, when we use the term victim, because it's a legal term that has rights and benefits within the criminal legal system, it's hard to avoid. So we tend to use victim to describe somebody who is actively being victimized through familial trafficking, and we use the term survivor to describe people who are no longer being exploited. That being said, we recognize that many people with lived experience do not prefer specific terms or have different preferences on terms. We just chose to use these to try to be consistent and clear what we meant. Next slide. So what do we know about familial trafficking? I think most of us know there's very limited literature and academic research out there, and most of what's come out has been within the last like 2 years in terms of academic research. There are also very few practitioner-based resources, so resources specifically to help people implement programs and serve. It's also an underidentified form of trafficking that's misidentified as other co-occurring crimes, meaning people might identify child sexual abuse and miss that there's also a trafficking component. Um, and in general, it's a form of trafficking that at some points people just cannot believe is possible because it's hard to imagine a family member harming a family member. Next slide. So this research was inspired by the field. Let me try that again. RTI International is also a training and technical assistance provider in the OVC space. We work with improving outcomes for child and youth trafficking victims, grantees, which are state-based anti-trafficking responders. And we heard time and time again from our field that there was a lack of evidence and they wanted to know what are the best practices to serve these populations. What do we need to know? So we held some events to support learning within these grantees. We conducted a literature review and we found that there was just limited information out there. So RTI decided to fund a research project to try to fill that gap. I will say this is exploratory research, which means it's like really starting from square one and it's a small study. So it's a little limited, but it's a great first step. And just for fun, this is a photo of some of our grantees in our OVC grant monitor in March of 2024. RTI had a chance to work with our whole team to present on our state's responses to familial trafficking for our grantees, which was so much fun. Next slide. Okay, so our research questions for this project are, how do service providers and public health responders identify and respond to cases of familial trafficking, juvenile familial trafficking in Louisiana? The second is, what do those cases look like? Are there any perceived differences between victims of familial trafficking or those who experience third-party trafficking? And if so, what are those differences? And then the last question is, what future research or resources are necessary to support practitioners serving this population? Next slide. So the research design is first we conducted a scoping review, which is just a literature review with a very specific methodology. We went through all of the practitioner resources and the literature, academic literature, to learn what have people found so far about human trafficking for familial trafficking. We interviewed 10 anti-trafficking providers with experience serving people who identify as familial trafficking survivors within Louisiana to better understand the scope and nature of cases that had been identified. And then we interviewed 5 survivors of child familial trafficking to better understand how their treatment and service interventions were effective or not as effective. And I'll note that we interviewed folks who were over the age of 18 who no longer were in their trafficking situation, who had experienced juvenile familial trafficking. And we will share a little bit more. But the whole goal of this research, again, was research to practice. So we did the research with the intent that the first thing we did was provide that evidence to the field and make sure that that information was readily available for folks to apply it to their work. Next slide. All right, and now what you've actually been waiting for, I'm going to hand it off to Peyton to share about our findings from this research.
Thank you so much, Leanne. So we can go to the next slide. So what we found from those interviews was what I'm sure you all can guess. Familial trafficking is an extremely prevalent form of trafficking. Um, of the victim service providers we interviewed, they said 50% or more of their clients may have familial ties involved in their trafficking, which complicates their situation and requires sensitivity, especially in the housing process. We also found that in these cases of familial trafficking, that grooming and exploitation often happened at an earlier age, or there was an earlier onset of those two things than in third-party trafficking situations. Which this is important because it kind of, tells us that we need to be more aware of these signs in younger victims. I think it's also important to mention that in Louisiana, there's a very comprehensive child advocacy center, center like support. I'm losing the language, Leanne, but it's a very supportive system that I know not all states have. So that's just another thing to keep in mind as we're going through these findings. We also found that many victims have a high level of involvement with different systems. So this really means that they encountered a ton of systems like child welfare, or, they were sent to a guidance counselor a lot in school, or they had some sort of other involvement with a institution that really failed to recognize their trafficking or exploitation experiences. So this really, shows us that housing providers specifically should be trained to identify the signs of trafficking and understand the specific needs of familial trafficking victims, which obviously we'll talk about in a little more depth later. Um, we also found that victims may have a history of familial exploitation. So like maybe their parent or sibling also has experienced something similar. So there's this level of generational trauma that can also kind of complicate these dynamics even more and make it seem not like exploitation, but more so just like a normal experience in this family. Um, we often heard from survivors that this was just something that they did. They never really questioned it because it was something that their mom did or their grandma did. So that was a really interesting finding as well. We found that victims also kind of had this level of internalized shame because they also never questioned their parental figures, so they just did as they were told. And so that was also a different kind of complex finding that we got out of these interviews with survivors. There was also this deep sense of obligation to be kind of like the caregiver for the family. So there was often a vulnerability in the household, which we'll see in that next box there under perpetrators, that kind of, so the victims felt like they needed to fill this void almost through these actions. So that led to some more internalized shame and self-worth challenges. We also found that there were these extreme trauma bonds, and I know trauma bond is like a very hot button word and we use it a lot, but Shawnee will also talk about that in more depth later on. So that was another consideration that we saw as being slightly different than third party trafficking, just something that was unique to these cases as well. For perpetrators, we found that in most cases, anecdotally, in these interviews with service providers, that the perpetrators were mothers or grandmothers, followed by, I believe, boyfriends. And Leanne, what was the next? Was it? I get mixed up if it was uncles or
The
stepfathers,
the
but
next
the male
was
figure.
partners of a mother, and
Hmm.
then it was fathers and grandfathers.
Hmm.
So the unique thing was that the tie to a mother figure was like the top three, and then it was other family members, which really surprised us.
Yeah, definitely. Like I mentioned, there was a vulnerability in the household, whether that be a financial vulnerability, substance use in the household. Um, they also, service providers mentioned a lot, a disability or an adult not being able to work and receive income themselves. So, another vulnerability that could lead to this type of situation. Um, we also found that familial bonds and attachment, that emotional attachment, were used as coercion in many of these cases, to fit in that definition of the force, fraud, and coercion of trafficking. And then, as I mentioned, there was often this multi-generational component where either, a parental figure had experienced this themselves, or they were actively experiencing this and bringing their children in as kind of to continue on in that exploitation, whether um, all of this to say it was very complicated, as I'm sure you guys are gathering from this. And we're also trying to, speak on this in a very trauma-informed way and not understanding the complexities of what could have led to these situations. But it all was, we just kept using that word over and over again, complex, dynamic, all of that kind of stuff. Um, for the tracking activity, we found that it was most often advertised through personal networks, which was a little bit different than third-party trafficking, where we typically think of either like online advertisements or that kind of thing. This type of trafficking was really like word of mouth, connecting with people that they know in the community. So there was like this closer proximity, which we'll talk about on the next slide as well. We found that this type of trafficking most often occurred within the home or other private spaces, and that most cases were involved in familial sex trafficking, but there were only a couple of cases of labor trafficking that were discussed. Um, and those like were really centered around forced child care or like um, there was a few like dog breeding situations, and then a construction situation as well. But for the most part, they were focused on familial sex trafficking. Next slide, please. And I think Leanne defined what we mean by third-party trafficking in the chat. So if anybody has questions on that, I think that definition is there. But like I was saying before, we found that there was more relational proximity between the perpetrator, the buyer, and the victim. So in these cases, the buyer was someone, for the most part, that the victim had knowledge of, like a neighbor or, someone that they knew in the community. Um, which kind of raised another point that I think is really important for housing providers, that there's this need for the victim to be separated from not only their physical home, but also an offending caregiver. And so I know in a lot of times, in different child welfare models, of course, the goal is to do the family reunification, but sometimes that's not always in the best interest. It's really difficult also to like understand the level of knowledge that a caregiver had. So the service providers we talked to, they discussed having a really hard time kind of teasing apart like culpability, like to really understand if it was safe for that child to go back into the home, and that kind of thing. Um, some providers also shared that the emotional response or experience with trafficking was different between clients who had experienced familial trafficking versus third-party trafficking because of those, like we mentioned, those that trauma bond, the attachment, all of those other things that were involved with someone who you so deeply trusted doing this. And also, as we all know, it's the struggle to kind of understand what was happening to you in general. Um, and so they mentioned that it was a lot more anger involved in the emotional response and some of the like counseling or support groups that they would hold. So that is, also important for housing providers to know whenever you may be housing people who've experienced this and their emotional response may seem different, just something to keep in mind and to understand. We also found that it was more difficult for familial trafficking victims to disclose their victimization, again, because of that insecure attachment to their primary caregiver and them just like wanting to be with their caregiver, and not wanting to cause any tension or separation there. Next slide, please. We also gathered information in the interviews around common barriers to identification, and we've kind of broken them down into this individual level, community systems level, and societal level for barriers to identification. So one was obviously the misconceptions about what trafficking looks like. I think everybody is aware that there are definitely stereotypes out there of what trafficking looks like, quote unquote. And so, even more so in these situations where Leanne mentioned earlier, there's this level of cognitive dissonance that people have of not believing that, like, especially I think a mother could do this to their child or something like that. And it's also, um, I think I maybe left this off the slide, but the providers talked a lot about how, especially the youth that experience this, are just labeled as bad kids because their behaviors are coming off as like troublesome. They're skipping school or not wanting to go home after school. They're just like causing trouble in people's eyes when really it's like a cry for help and them trying to get out of this situation, or just their actions kind of manifesting from this level of trauma and exploitation. At the community and systems level, there are a lot of limitations with the existing screening tools around identification of familial trafficking. So, and also with trafficking in youth in general, the screening tools aren't really geared for children to understand the terms or the concepts that are being asked of them. Or there's not a lot of granularity, I guess you could say, in like perpetrator types. So sometimes familial trafficking can definitely get missed or, misconstrued as a co-occurring crime, as Leanne mentioned earlier, like child abuse, all of those types of things. At the individual level, like I mentioned, there's this misunderstanding of victimization from the provider side of things, either thinking of that it's the bad behavior kind of manifesting itself or the misidentification of the co-occurring crimes. Obviously, from the victim survivor perspective, a fear of reporting and being separated from their family, being put into another system that could also be harmful, all of those types of things. And then, as I mentioned, misunderstanding trauma responses in general. Next slide, please.
Peyton, before we transition, this is Leanne. I noticed that Sade asked in the chat, in the literature review, was there anything that showed regarding the impact of screening on adult familial trafficking victims and survivors? And I just wanted to note that there are no validated screening tools that ask about perpetrator identity. And I think particularly when we're thinking about assessment tools, less so screening tools, screening being, do they qualify for our services, and assessment being putting together a treatment plan. That's where the challenge is if we don't know the perpetrator identity, it may mean that we're missing information about which interventions are going to be helpful or not. So, for example, we often talk about how creating family bonds and support for survivors of violence can be a resilience factor. But if somebody was abused by a family member, that probably is not a pathway that you want to take. And so that's where we saw these missed opportunities and opportunities to improve our treatment options by knowing a bit more to know what to offer and what not to really like individualize that care for the person based on what their needs are. I hope that answers that question. Sorry, Peyton, go ahead.
No, thank you so much, Leanne. Yes, and if you guys have any questions, just put them in the chat. We have plenty of time to discuss them throughout the presentation, and I think we'll have time at the end as well. Um, so we also gathered a lot of information from those survivor interviews around their barriers to engagement and also what service providers kind of saw as barriers to engagement for their clients. And at the system and societal level, as we've already mentioned a few times, there's this level of victim blaming or a lack of belief in disclosure of violence, because again, it's very complex. Again, we'll use that word like a million times, but um, these youth can often have the behaviors, like we were saying, that some people see as or label as just bad kids. And so when they say, well, this has happened to me, and it was, this family member that did that, a lot of time there's that level of cognitive dissonance, like, oh no, like you've already said this and this and this, like this just can't be true. And that, or that's the fear that keeps them from saying that, even if it's something. And a few of the survivors we interviewed had said that they had disclosed multiple times to people who just didn't believe them. And so I don't think that's shocking to any of us here, but just something that, is important for us to document. There was a level of stigma and judgment, and also limited resources as a community, especially around housing placement and safe housing. Um, at the organizational level, like we said, there was this lack of screening tools or awareness of familial trafficking, which often led to that identifying it more so as a co-occurring crime. There was a limited capacity internally to really serve victim survivors of familial trafficking because their needs are a little bit different and the support they need are a little bit different. So tailoring it wasn't really a possibility due to that limited capacity. And then a lack of trauma informed care and some of the other social services that they were attempting to access. And then at the individual level for a victim survivor to engage, there was this level of loyalty to the family unit, trauma bonding and attachment, and then also using those familial ties and that attachment as coercion, and then also just a limited awareness of resources available, especially in some of the more rural parts of Louisiana. Even though there was a CAC presence there, like the people living there, aren't sure what that is or that that's even a thing that they can access. Slide, please. So this slide really lays out all of the needs that practitioners identified for survivors. So that included behavioral health services, advocacy services, especially judicial advocacy. So that legal advocacy piece, especially with all of the different complicating factors of being a caregiver in some cases, and kind of understanding the youth's rights there. They talked about the need for reproductive care, so really understanding, STD care, that kind of thing. A lot of early pregnancy or miscarriage came up a few times as well. So having care for that and having access to that. Mentorship. So Shawnee's going to talk in a little bit about like the promising practices we found, but mentorship in this kind of like coaching aspect of being with a trusted adult and someone that can show you like what those healthy relationships should be looking like was really important. Safe shelter, which obviously is really relevant to you all, and that kind of included because I know safe's like kind of a broad word there, but really like a trauma informed space where they victim survivors felt comfortable coming into and staying, something that didn't really remind them of their the place where their exploitation occurred, since most of it was occurring in the home we found. And then also specialized therapy and therapeutic interventions, which again, Shawnee will talk about in more depth in a little bit. Next slide, please. And from the survivor's perspective, their needs also aligned with what practitioners identified. So it was really the number one thing that came up and why we were so excited to get to talk to you all today was this immediate safety and housing that meets their basic needs. So this what this really looked like. For example, one of the survivors talked about going to a emergency shelter type of environment where they it was a co-ed facility. The men stayed in one side, the women stayed in the other, but they waited in line with men, and that made them really uncomfortable because it reminded them it was a trigger for them of their exploitation. And then another person shared when they sought shelter in a similar situation that they were also with a lot of older men who were using substances, and that was a big trigger for them because their family used substances, which is what kind of facilitated their exploitation or necessitated it, I suppose. The survivors also recognized opportunities for education, financial literacy, and empowerment was something that they really wanted because um, they talked about a lot since these things happened to them and kind of a formative time where you're supposed to be learning how to do all of these things. They missed a lot of school, so they needed that education. They didn't understand anything about like um, kind of what this like functional I'm trying to think of like the financial literacy piece, like adult function. Like they just didn't understand that. They weren't given those tools. So they really wanted to learn how to do those things for themselves. Um, they really wanted, along with like education for themselves, education for other practitioners that people who may experience familial trafficking would come in contact with, so that they could feel validated and believed when they were disclosing those trafficking experiences and feel confident that someone would believe them and help them. So that kind of covers those last two bullets there.
Peyton, can I add one layer of complexity to this? So I think one thing that's important to notice is like there was not consistency from the survivor feedback around like levels of barriers to enter shelter. So we heard from some participants that low barrier access was so important for them to be able to get care and support. And that was a real benefit to them, and that they had challenges with places that, for example, had requirements related to substance use or required detox or things of that nature. Whereas we heard from other participants that they felt unsafe if there were other people in the shelter-based setting with them who were using substances, or they felt unsafe if there weren't certain requirements or didn't feel that it was as productive. And so that kind of surprised us that there was, in a way, it surprised us that there was such a variety of perspectives. I think it also reiterated to us that different people need different things for success and reminded us that there's no wrong door to care. And so I just wanted to name that because I know that is such a difficult thing to navigate as a housing provider, and we do not have answers. But we did ask and we heard a lot about it. It meant a lot to the folks we talked to, despite the fact there were many different pieces of feedback on it. Okay,
Mhm.
ignore me now. Thank you.
Yes, and I was going to say, I think that's exactly what a lot of these quotes show you. So I'll just give everyone like 2 minutes to read through them. But they're kind of those top two there are the two situations that I was mentioning earlier. Um, and I think these slides, right, Shade will be available too with the recording. Okay, perfect, perfect. So, if you didn't get through all of them, no worries. You'll just have some light reading later on. Um, So, some of the housing challenges that we've already talked about were these limited safe shelter options, and safe meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So, really, like understanding I think, how you can make the most people feel safe, or also that you can't make everyone feel safe. So just trying to do, the best you can through your trauma-informed care processes. All of those things are really important to accommodate trafficking survivors, especially youth. One of the survivors we talked to spoke about how they aged out of the youth shelters at 18 and had to go to an adult one, even though they weren't developmentally ready for that yet, and how that kind of set them back in their healing because then they had to deal with all of these other things that came at them really fast. We've talked about unsafe or inappropriate housing environments, so the co-ed situation causing discomfort, which I think we can all understand, and also placing the young survivors in proximity to older adults, which can create additional risks and distress for them if those were the people involved in their exploitation. Next slide.
Oh, so sorry, Peyton. One more thing
That's
that I want to lift up, just because, adding like the color commentary that's housing specific is, I put it in the chat, but I was really surprised by the number of stories we heard about survivors just not being believed by shelter staff. We
mhm,
heard how impactful that was. We heard from at least a couple of the interviews talked about how they ended up actually leaving that setting because people didn't believe them, said it was fanciful, that they were making it up, that they were blaming. And so I think it just reiterates, even in like and in those cases, it was in housing settings that were geared toward folks who are experiencing homelessness.
mhm,
But it reminds me that we have to ensure that no matter what the movement is, whatever the housing space is, that we're sharing this knowledge across to our partner movements to make sure that their staff are ready to respond appropriately to disclosures, because it has major impacts in terms of that trust that those individuals will have with future interactions with service providers. So when they come to your door, they may have already been told by other providers, blaming and shaming statements that you have to work to undo. So I think this tells us a lot about like how important our partnership is. And then also it gives us more empathy to understand why folks may not want to come to us in the first place and how much more trust building we have to do to overcome those past experiences.
definitely, definitely. Yes, and I will say that most of the feedback we received, that was more not negative, but negative, were from those emergency shelter situations. So the constant movement between shelters or being forced to leave during the day, which, to make space for everybody or having to wait in line to get a bed, that kind of thing. That lack of stability really was difficult for people to deal with while they were also on this healing journey of the trying to heal from their exploitation. Um, and then the need for survivor-centered and trauma-informed housing also came up. There were a few housing providers in Louisiana that were specific to young girls who had experienced trafficking, and the people that we interviewed from those areas were so, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the word, but very not supportive. um like the survivors who were receiving care for them were very complimentary, there we go, oh my gosh, sorry guys, about that service and how they wish like they had known about it sooner and how important that was to their healing. So I think the general takeaway is obviously there's no one size fits all solution, but knowing all of these things and all of these complexities and dynamics in familial trafficking and how those can come up differently for different people is really important as a housing provider to keep in mind. Um, so I know I just shared a lot. Does anyone have any questions? I'll check the chat too.
Well, Peyton, this is really helpful. And I think since there aren't any questions in the chat, maybe what we can do is transition for Shawnee's section to start to talk about promising practices.
That sounds great. Shawnee?
Awesome. Thank you, Peyton. And so Peyton shared a lot about the findings, what survivors and what practitioners disclosed in the interviews that were conducted. And so now we want to transition into promising practices. I bet much of what you'll hear are things that you might be doing already, or maybe doing in some capacity, but really wanting to give language and create a space to actually apply some of the learning and the knowledge into practice. So we're going to first touch on just some of the overarching TA recommendations, and then we'll really dive deep into a recommendation of working or developing programs that are utilizing relationships as a form of healing. So a consistent theme that came up across survivors and practitioners was just the impact of what relationships can do in the healing process. Next slide, thank you. So what should providers know? The recommendations that came through, or the themes that came through, were we really wanted to emphasize strengthening multidisciplinary responses. We do know that survivors are going to engage with a variety of different professionals and entities. And so as experts in the field, or as liaisons and those who are advocating for on behalf of survivors, really working with other professionals and different entities to develop responses that are trauma-informed and that can also leverage the relationship component that we're going to talk about today. We also have the recommendation, what providers should know is to build expertise in familial trafficking identification and response. And so that was something that came up, and we know that this is something that is even reflected in the research, right? There's not a lot of, there are not screening tools available. The identification, the red flags, or, indicators of what trafficking may look like in when it's perpetrated by a family member are not as widely known as some of the other screening and assessment and identification practices. So that's something that was a recommendation. And also really focusing on prioritizing relational interventions. And so that's what we'll really talk about in the next several slides. So next slide, please. Yeah, so this just highlights kind of what we just chatted about, but thinking about the variety of professionals or community members that may be engaging with survivors, whether that be volunteers in your entity. We know that law enforcement will often play a big role, child welfare professionals, counselors, foster parents even. So one of the needs in the field is to strengthen identification and screening across all of these disciplines. What does it look like to identify a survivor of trafficking? And then what would be the, response protocols and practices that need to be developed? Peyton shared a bit about the barriers to disclosure. And I think we probably all know and recognize that survivors of trafficking in any form have some barriers, right, to disclosure. And oftentimes it's up to professionals or those who are engaging to be able to identify. But familial trafficking survivors have some very unique and complex barriers that may not be present in other forms or typologies of trafficking. And then the need to integrate relational interventions into training and programs and policies. I think we've probably all been to a training or read a brief or something, and we think it sounds really great in practice, but we just don't know how, right? And so the need to get technical assistance and guidance and really be able to translate what we learn into actual practice. And, I'll also admit, that housing professionals have a unique set of challenges because you have to create safety in the environment while also, having individualized care, similar to what was shared previously about substance use issues or things like that, are really hard to manage in a housing setting. So I do want to lift that up and acknowledge that. So next slide, please. Okay, so if you're available or able to, I want to just kind of pause and take a second to think through this question here. In what ways do familial trafficking survivors require different supports and responses? You know, if you are able to, you can drop that in the chat as you kind of think through how, you know, survivors of familial trafficking might have some different needs than maybe some other typologies. And if not dropping, just taking a moment to reflect on what may be different in responding to this type of trafficking. Okay. So it looks like no responses in the chat, but one thing that was pointed out earlier was the complex relationship between the perpetrator being a family member or a caregiver, and how that complicates kind of some of the natural or some of the common ways that we provide services, right? In service provision, often some of the goals are strengthening your family supports, right? But that's often not going to be a viable option in some of their care, right? And really, when I think about housing professionals, many times trafficking survivors go to an inpatient or a recovery program, but with the goal of transitioning back home to family members. Well, survivors of familial trafficking often don't have that option. And so what does that look like for a survivor of familial trafficking to, how is housing disrupted, right, when that happens? And so that's something to consider, the need for housing supports. So relational trauma, again, Peyton touched on this a bit.
Sorry, Shawnee. Before you continue, we have some responses in the chat if you wanted to take a peek at those.
Oh, sure. Yeah, let's see. What do we have? Oh, relational development, for sure, right? So we'll talk a bit about, but we all know how important that caregiver relationship is in developing relational skills, regulation, behavioral health. All of these things are really important. So thank you for sharing that. Let's see what family and community engagement looks like in the future for them is different, yes. Transportation, food, medical, basically all of the basic needs that a family provides, right? The supports that a family might provide an individual can be disrupted. And so the amount of resources, community support will probably vastly be different. Discerning when it's appropriate to engage in the conversations or supporting around reconnecting with family members. One of the things that did come up too in some of the interviews is that even if there was one main perpetrator, some of the other family members were complicit, right? So maybe they weren't the, trafficker per se, but they were complicit. They knew what was going on and did not serve as protective factors for that survivor. I'm not sure if I missed anything. Foster care would look different. It would look different, right? Because what is the goal? What is the family reunification goal in those circumstances? Kinship care, yeah, all of those things. So yeah, thank you for your comment. And thanks for pointing that out, Lee, and I completely did not see them. But yeah, those are lots of different things that are needing to be considered when we're thinking about providing care, housing, transition planning for people who have experienced familial trafficking. So we'll jump back into defining relational trauma. One of the takeaways was we want to really promote relational interventions because there's a common quote in the field or knowledge in the field that shares that trauma that occurs in relationships is healed in relationships. And it doesn't necessarily mean the same relationship that the individual who has kind of broken that trust, but it could be another safe adult, other people, even housing providers, landlords, things like that. Relational trauma is psychological or emotional harm that occurs in the context of close relationships, and really can bring disruption that has in an individual's life, in their development, and in their just general well-being. Some of the implications of that are here listed here. Difficulty trusting and depending on others, which would certainly impact even the caregiving or the helping relationship. Dysregulation and anxiety. I think as a provider in any sense, housing provider, managing dysregulation is, a common challenge, managing crisis, behavioral crises. And how do we do that from a relational approach? Insecure and disorganized attachment patterns and how those develop and then impact one's ability to relate outside of that relationship. Developing shame, managing that self-worth, self-efficacy, and just all of the things that come up when someone's experienced relational trauma. One of the trainings that I attended, and it's called TBRI, and many of you may know that. It's a trauma-informed care model, but one of the practices that I shared a lot with staff was monitoring and understanding and really thinking about the behaviors that we are experiencing from residents, survivors, and we just question ourselves, is the behavior willful or is it survival, right? Is the activity or the behavior that we're trying to manage in a housing setting, is that a trauma response, and then how do we respond appropriately? In the trauma recovery space, Judith Herman is a renowned psychologist, and she's known for her work in trauma and recovery work. And this is such an old book, but it really kind of emphasizes where we're headed, that recovery can only take place within the context of relationships. And it doesn't occur in isolation. So really the practitioner, the housing professional, even law enforcement, or whoever is engaging with the survivor, have the ability and the capability of being a healing relationship for that individual. And another thing, I'm a clinician also, but one thing we say is you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic, right? You can still help and aid a survivor, help empower them to work towards their recovery and healing without having, that type of licensure too. So next slide, sorry. And the next one. Thank you. So what are relational interventions? Basically, they're interventions that center the relationship between the service provider, the professional, and the survivor as the key point of recovery. So they are trauma-informed approaches. They're using safe and consistent relationships and really focusing on connection, fostering attachment, and reducing relational disruptions, and really just creating basically different experiences for individuals who have often been, have had really kind of bad experiences. And so, yeah, next slide. Yeah. Again, just kind of really emphasizing that providers themselves are the intervention in this type of model. So by promoting consistency, predictability, and compassion, those are kind of the tools that are in play to repair some of the harm caused, the relational trauma that's been caused in these situations. And so the goal of relational interventions are they help to rebuild trust, and psychological safety. They support emotional regulation and stability. So being an individual that a survivor can co-regulate with, and then develop additional coping skills and really different patterns of relating to other people. Fostering secure attachment, helping them develop healthy boundaries, and then transforming relationships from harming to healing. So we can go to the next slide. Oh, we are at the next. Let's see. This again just kind of emphasizes the importance of the healing relationship, and the emphasis on interventions that center connection as the primary healing tool here. And so now we're going to really kind of focus on what it looks like to integrate some of this into practice. It causes us to really kind of reflect on our practices. What are we doing? And I know there's probably a variety of different types of providers here, whether that's emergency shelter or scatter site housing, safe houses, things like that. But really taking a look at some of our program practices, and assessing, you know, what we're doing traditionally, and then how do we transition to a more relational approach. These models really help model co-regulation and empathy in our service delivery. And again, I want to lift up and acknowledge how hard it is to run housing programs. You know, it's a lot of work. It requires a lot of training. It requires a lot of understanding of trauma-informed care and things like that. So how do we embed these interventions into policies, environment, and staffing structures? So not just the individual themselves, but, you know, what might it look like to work with a landlord, right, in this capacity? Maybe the landlord themselves is not going to be fully trained in trauma-informed care, right? But when you come up with a MOU or an agreement with this site, what are some of the things that you can do to implement some of these practices or approaches? Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. And I will admit this slide is a lot to digest, so I will take a second to let you just kind of look it over, and then we'll talk through it. But again, this will be shared out after the presentation as kind of a practical tool and approach to moving from a traditional approach to a relational approach in practice. All right, so with that, just kind of taking a look at this chart, some of the areas that are common in service delivery, common in housing programs, are your intake, your case management, your training, your house rules, how we communicate, how do you respond to conflict resolution in a shelter setting? You're in a communal setting, lots of different personalities, lots of different needs, sometimes understaffed, so there's staffing challenges. There's lots of things that come up in a housing setting, and really thinking about substance use and relapse. And I'm sure we all have personal experiences of when we've worked in this space and what that looks like. How do you manage someone on site who maybe, you know, maybe you have a zero tolerance policy? What does that look like? Is it possible to shift that from a more traditional approach to a more relational approach, right? Can those issues be addressed differently? And so this just gives us an example of what it looks like to move from traditional to relational approaches, but they're really centered on safety, the relationship, even thinking about the house rules. Are they rigid? Are they punitive? Or are there ways in which you can come from a more communal process, right? Can we do community agreements in the event that there is a rule violation or a safety concern? What does it look like to address that? And staff training. I know we all focus on documentation and grant management, but what does it look like for staff members to then also be trained in relational interventions, attachment-based interventions, and this can even apply to like how we supervise our staff, right? Like so trauma-informed ways in which we're relating to staff that can then translate into how they are engaging with individuals in the programs. So again, this will be shared out after this presentation. So next slide.
Oh, Shawnee, before you move on, can I give an example of like a victory related to, because I know we talked so much about challenges. I just wanted to share like one example from a provider that we talked to that implemented a relational intervention within their setting. We're using these like very formal words. I want to be clear, these are things you're already doing if you're trauma informed. These are just like kind of clinical words, but there was one housing provider that serves juvenile survivors in Louisiana who trained all of their staff in this TBRI, trust-based relational intervention. All of their staff, including like their front desk manager, their finance director, because it's all co-located in the same place. So everyone who's engaging with the young folks in that shelter setting are trained. And there was one particular client who the way that their trauma manifested tended to be through like physical outbursts, which was really challenging for the dynamic within the home. And the executive director of all people was engaging with that young person just in the day to day. And she told me this story that after a couple months, this young person kind of like stomped up the stairs and said, "Miss So and so, I cannot believe it. This other resident is, it's messy in here and I felt really frustrated, but I decided I was going to come talk to you instead of yelling at her. So I'm going to talk to you about it right now." And so that moment for this executive director was super powerful because that relationship had been established, even though she wasn't like a case manager or direct care person, but was in community with that young person to be able to identify that reaction and redirect it in a more productive way and less disruptive way and in a relational way. So that was the story that this executive director told to describe just how powerful TBRI was with helping these young folks with their healing and overcoming some of the attachment issues they had. So I think that these interventions can show up in small ways, not just like the biggest victories, but in the day-to-day too, to help with like how clients interact with each other or those sorts of things, which is really exciting. And it keeps us going when we got those happy stories like that. Okay, sorry, Shawnee. I just love that story.
No, thank you for sharing that. It was a good story. So no, thank you for sharing that. I mean, and there's a good example too, right? Because everyone, if possible, everyone who is engaging in whatever capacity may be trained at various levels, right? But even at the policy level, when we're thinking about trauma-informed care and relational interventions, you do want a full staff adoption if possible, right? Like all the way to the CEO to make these really kind of integrated throughout the program. So we'll go to the next slide, Sade. So lastly, some of the recommendations. I mean, we've summarized a lot, but really wanting to focus on enhancing screening and identification across systems. And that would, requiring us to understand the complexities of familial trafficking, including what that trauma bond looks like, how to help someone through that, and understanding why victims would still want to protect their parent or seek love and acceptance by family members, right? So that's a natural part of, a caregiving relationship and really a human need. So really navigating that carefully, and planning some of the things that you're going to be doing with them. Focusing on reducing engagement barriers and promoting trust through some of these relational interventions. Incorporating trauma responsive interventions and attachment-based care through service delivery. And so I know that we've called out, Leanne has called out, and I think I may have as well, TBRI is just one of those models of a relational-based trauma-informed care program that's been adopted in Louisiana. It's also been adopted widely, in other areas in Texas. I'm in Texas also, and so those are programs that, kind of have the same framework in mind and can accomplish some of these things. So those are the recommendations. And then I think with that, I'll pass it off to Leanne.
All right. Thank you so much, Shawnee. So to close out our component of presenting, and then we want to open it up to any specific questions you have, I want to make sure that we highlight some of the products that we put together that are specifically for practitioners like you that will give you a little more insight into what we've been talking about today. Sade, if you want to go to the next slide. There are three main products that are out right now that we want to lift up. The first is we have a report on our findings called From Research to Practice, Insight for Effective Familial Trafficking Responses. This is a plain language 9-page report of our research findings. So, part of us committing to, really doing research to practice is that we made all of our practitioner resources first and then are dealing with the academic stuff later. So this 9-page report just gives a brief overview over all of the topics that we talked about today. You'll get a few more of like the quotes and direct insight from survivors and practitioners with that. And it gives some links as well for related information and promising practices that we're seeing in the field from folks like you who are providing direct services. The next thing that we put together is a practitioner brief, which is a practitioner brief that centers on utilizing, so sorry, I'm totally losing my train of thought. It's called Healing Connections, Relational Approaches to Support Familial Trafficking Survivors. So that's a research brief that, again, it's in plain language, it's for providers, and it's specifically talking about what Shawnee discussed, which is implementing relational interventions in care settings with trafficking survivors and trying to explore why those might be effective care mechanisms with trafficking survivors who've experienced familial trafficking. And then the last thing we did is a research and training and technical assistance agenda. Basically, because this is such it's a topic with not very much information that's formalized out there, we put together this agenda to help future researchers and future practitioners and folks who are seeking funding for programs that fill gaps to be able to say, this is what we should do next. This is where the gaps are. This is what we want to learn. And the hope with all three products is that you'll be able to use them whether for advocacy, for program development, or honestly, even to give some language to describe things you already may be doing. And you can find all of these resources on our landing page, but I'll put the link in the chat that you can click to, and all three of those documents are there. And we'll make sure that all three of those get shared with you following this training today as well. And I think that's all I've got before we move to Q&A. So, Sade, why don't I hand it back to you?
Yes, perfect. So before we get to Q&A, if we can virtually give our facilitators, Shani, Leanne, and Peyton, a round of applause. Thank you all so much for that information. And yeah, just while we're clapping, if y'all have any questions that y'all have to ask, you can go ahead and come off mute or feel free to add them to the chat. And while people are maybe getting their thoughts together, my first question, if I may ask, is there going to be a part two to this series or something that actually focuses on adult survivors, or like, is there plans to continue this research?
This is Leanne. I can take that question. So yes, the goal for this exploratory research was to do a small study. So then we can say, look, we did this. There's so much more we want to learn. please give us money to go do more. So the hope is that we will be able to take it to then do bigger research projects with a bigger geographic scope, a bigger scope of the folks that we talk to in terms of like survivor identities and ages, um, and whatever the future could take us. I know, for example, we wanted to learn a little bit more about familial labor trafficking, and that just wasn't an area with a lot of expertise with the folks we talked about. So there's so much opportunity out there that we want to explore if we can find the resources to do so. And if anyone is interested in partnering on research, shameless plug from RTI is that RTI does love partnering with community organizations. So we'll make sure our information's put in the chat. If that's something you'd like to partner on or learn more, please do let us know.
And I see we have for so other people, thank you so much. And please, organizations that's open to that collaboration, it sounds like it'd be really fruitful. We got just some comments in the chat.
Mhm.
Our housing program is more about providing rental assistance to people that live in a community rather than in a shelter, so they'd appreciate more training around best practices for non-shelter programs.
Mhm. Yes, that is a great point. And I think, for folks who are providing assistance that's less hands-on, it's more hands-off, I think the opportunity here is to consider where are the touch points that you have with those survivors and where can you incorporate those relational interventions, or who are some people who might be able to use the relational interventions. And then the other thing is to think about that screening and identification. Are there any times where you would need to know about that background of a client in order to offer them unique services? And I don't think that everyone needs that, but for some service provision settings, for example, if we're talking about transitional age youth or children, you would probably want to know that in terms of your policies and regulations around parental or family member engagement with the client. So those are some areas that I would start to think about it, and absolutely we'll put our brains to it as well.
Yeah. All right. Any last questions? We're coming up on the 30 to the hour, and we definitely have a survey for folks. But any last questions that we have for the RTI team? All right. Well, thank you. Thank all three of you again so much. This was such an informative training, I mean, a webinar. And honestly, we would love to bring you back for a part two when it's time. So thank you so much.